What does it take for the world to wake up? The planet's sixth wave of mass extinction is well underway, according to a report issued at the conclusion of a UN Biodiversity conference here in Paris. We'll go over the chilling evidence. But as to what actually will be done about it, let's cut to the chase and say it. Truth is, well, we're all prisoners of our own contradictions. As London's recent Extinction Rebellion campaign shows, pressure to act is growing, and Green parties or their ideas across this continent are expected to make inroads in the EU elections that take place later this month. But we also want more jobs, more stuff, cheap travel, cheap food, more money in our pockets, more growth. As we head to 9 million humans and counting on this planet, is that growth compatible with going green, with truly going green? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what drastic measures for these drastic times. With us, she's in Paris, and she's been taking part in that biodiversity conference in UNESCO. Kate Broman, lead scientist at the Global Water Initiative at the University of Minnesota.
It is a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for coming. Thanks as well to Henri Landes of the advocacy group Landestini, which helps to
preserve biodiversity.
You have a lottery going on to protect wetlands in the Auvergne region in the center of France right now.
That's our latest initiative, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, good luck with that. Jeremy Guez, who teaches international affairs and economics at Paris's prestigious HEC school. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And we want to welcome, joining us from the northern town of Le Crotoy, European elections candidate Patricia Chagnon, regional councillor for the Hauts-de-France region for Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National. Thank you for joining the conversation.
Thank you for having me this evening.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, hashtag F24debate. 1970, that's the year this morbid trend kicked into high gear, according to that UN study, with 60% of the animals that populate the land, sky, and sea have been wiped out since. Andrew Hillier has more.
Nature pushed to the brink. With up to 1 million species threatened by extinction, the UN is urging countries to make profound changes before it's too late.
The report says that protecting biodiversity amounts to protecting humanity. After all, we human beings depend on biodiversity. We're part and parcel of this system of human reactions, which we don't value enough.
The report issued on Monday is the first comprehensive analysis of this situation across the world. It lays bare a planet hurtling towards a future in which its rich biodiversity becomes a thing of the past. 1 million species are under threat, driven to extinction by mankind. With deforestation, species have lost their habitats. There's overfishing, and climate change is making the world too hot for many animals and insects. Animals are also suffering from the spread of invasive species, whose number has increased by 70% in half a century. Then there's pollution, which is driving down insect populations.
The big things causing butterflies to disappear are industrial, modern agricultural farming, and particularly the chemicals that we use in farming, which are killing insects essentially, but also development and climate change.
But scientists insist there are solutions. If humans review their habits by walking more and riding bikes, and reduce food waste, for example. It's not just about saving plants and animals. Humanity's survival is tied to the planet's biodiversity. If species continue to disappear at the current rate, it could lead to the collapse of entire ecosystems and food chains, leading to more conflicts over scarce resources.
Kate Broman, you took an active part in the negotiations for coming up with that communique at the end of that biodiversity summit. It's a profession of faith, right? It's not binding as such. What, though, can be done fast now? Because we've seen the impact there. What needs to be done?
We've seen how important nature is to human well-being, and we've seen that nature is declining. And so what we really need to do is to take action, and to take major action. Transformational change is the way we talk about it. So it's everything from what we do at home, in terms of our diets, in terms of how we travel, to what our governments are doing, and the way that we run things like our food systems.
So just to explain for our viewers, we've had these regular climate change summits. Why is this one different?
This is actually a lot like those climate change summits, except it's bigger. What we're really trying to look at is not just the climate, but really, what does nature look like? What's happening with the state of nature and the state of how nature affects people? So everything from the amount of food and water that's available to how people actually interact with nature and find senses of identity.
And obviously there's measures that each citizen can do, not using straws and things like that. But really, things have to be done on a much bigger scale. So what is the recommendation that you'd like to point to from that?
I will point to a couple, but I will say that we don't choose a single recommendation because it's going to take lots of different approaches. I would say that for people on an individual level, really thinking about what we eat is going to be critical. We know for our own health that eating more vegetables, more fruits and nuts is good. We know that's good for the planet too.
Jean-Miguel, do you like a good steak?
I like a good steak. I have to admit, I like a good steak. That being said, it's the whole transformation process, our relationship to nature, our ability to basically start understanding the effects this has, and a process of education, both yourself and the people around you. And as we were saying, I'm not a scientist, I'm a social scientist, so I can only be a consumer of all of these studies. But what I find particularly striking is that this is not happening in a social and a political vacuum. It's happening at a very moment where so many people, rightfully so if you ask me, are expressing anger about political processes and are increasingly frustrated, saying, the rules of the game are rigged against me anyway. Do not claim, François Picard, that because I've eaten a steak tonight, that I'm a bad person because I'm basically throwing the planet off. All of those elites, all of those people making these decisions day after day after day, they're the ones responsible for all of this. This is an interesting contradiction, and I think it explains why humanity is so close to disaster and we're not acting, is that everyone is trying to point the finger to the other when we're basically trying to mobilize humanity as a whole. And this is going to be a transformation ranging from, exactly as you said, the simple individual to the governments.
All right, I'll confession time, right? The planet's in big trouble, Henri Landès, but it's not going to... humanity's not going to be wiped out tomorrow, so I did have hachis parmentier for lunch. What do we do to save the planet from people like me?
Well, the planet actually will do better once humans are not around, if that comes to the case. So actually, humanity's in trouble, not the planet. The planet has been going on for 4.5 billion years, and it took millions of years to create the conditions in which we could actually live. So we're destroying those conditions, so it's our fault and it's our loss in the long run. That being said, you could wake up tomorrow morning and say, all right, how do I connect with nature today? Because honestly, that's what led to my own conversion, and that's what leads to actually like doing all of this. Because very often it's difficult to say.
Okay, so you're self-starting, but here's the question.
Well, I've been doing this for a few years now, but
yeah, but do we need government ethics?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Governments should be saying, let's stop making all of the forests, soils, land areas artificial by either building on them or doing intensive agriculture that's monoculture, which is not a natural way for the earth to sustain itself. Because once you take away the diversity, that's what this is all about. It's biodiversity. Once you take away the diversity, you take away the resiliency, the production, the interactions between different plants, animals, and humans, who are animals also. And that's when you start creating vulnerability to all of the other effects of climate change and biodiversity loss, which is extreme weather events, floods, storms, heat waves, etc. So the reality is we should be saying, not are we going to preserve the planet, it's how do I, in the next few days and then in the next months, reconnect with nature in my daily habits, my daily life, so that I'm happier, because actually it's a pretty neat thing to realize how brilliant
But people don't
nature is.
self-regulate is what you're saying, and we need governments to step in.
Absolutely. And then it becomes about, when I look at candidates in an election, who understands the global picture of nature the most in his program, his or her program. And if they're not understanding with a global picture, they don't even deserve to be on the ballot, because it's It's extremely urgent times now for maintaining our habitat. It's not maintaining the planet, it's maintaining our habitat. We are completely destroying what actually lets us breathe, eat, move around healthily. And obviously there's a lot of inequality today, so some of us are already suffering from poor conditions in terms of environment.
Patricia Chagnon, do you agree?
I've been listening. It's with a lot of interest to the three speakers before me. I would like to start by saying that, we all agree that there is a very severe problem, that ecology is urgent. Although I would like to sort of put between brackets the sole responsibility that you're pointing the finger only at human activities. Let me just speak about France. France itself used to be a country covered in forests and actually gained biodiversity when agriculture started in France. And we had different types of landscapes coming together. And since in that time, which was the early 20th century, France was at its top of biodiversity. Now, that is not to say that I don't recognize there is a big problem. On the contrary, we do recognize there is a big problem. And I want to add one more thing to what your three speakers have just put forward. We cannot talk about ecology and protecting nature without talking about globalization. The globalization and the world market has caused tremendous havoc in other countries, producing cheaper consumer products, and is also taking a very heavy toll, of course, on transport and the cost to nature and to our environment for having huge cargo ships and airplanes flying around the world, carrying consumer goods. So I think we need to address globalization. And what I feel is essential in at least in my political view of the whole situation is that we start encouraging people again to produce and to consume very close to where they live, to treat their waste close to where they live.
All right, so in favor of short supply chains. In favor of short supply chains, are you willing to tell the people that might vote for you in those European elections on May the 26th that, well, they're going to probably have to pay a little bit more for their food, for instance?
I don't necessarily think that's true. I think short supply change will actually encourage a safer and better production, and it will not have an influence on prices. We can cut out a lot of the intermediaries and a lot of the transport costs. And when I go to the local markets and buy my food and my vegetables and my eggs and my poultry on the local markets, I do not pay it any more than I pay it in big supermarkets where the products are being flown in from across the world. So I don't believe that needs to be any more expensive. I believe it'll be much healthier, and it will create a much better relationship between the people who actually consume and those who actually produce our foods.
All right, lucky you, because the markets here in the Paris area are pretty expensive, Henri Landès. Your thoughts on short supply chains and how it's really become an issue that everyone on all sides of the political spectrum have embraced?
Yeah, it's a good news. That's the good news. All sides of the political spectrum in this country have embraced environmental issues. It's not the case for the country where I came from and where my colleague on my left is from, because not all sides of the political spectrum in the United States have decided to become very strong environmentalists and relocalize a lot of the system, although even Donald Trump wants to relocalize a lot of the economic system. We can talk about that. But short supply chains, short circuits, do allow for more resiliency of a territory and for local jobs to prosper and for to reconnect with the producers and with nature in an area.
But people like their strawberries in the month of December.
That we have to get used to understanding the costs and to stop consuming completely irresponsibly. That's the bottom line.
And so it's the question I asked earlier to Henri. At one point or another.
That doesn't mean stop eating steak. Just knows where does your steak come from and how was it raised?
Yeah. And I mean, as a good economist, I would say it's all about transparency of the system. Transparency includes not only knowing where it's coming from, but also paying the right price. And at some point in time, it's understanding that indeed you have to forego your strawberries unless you're willing to pay a very substantial high price. The globalization part, I think we should be a little bit careful about it. Because on the other hand, first and foremost, it has lifted a wide range of populations out of poverty. at a cost that we can discuss, but this is something, as a Westerner, I'm not very comfortable discussing, because it's very easy for us to start blaming globalization for all the woes of the world and forgetting about all of those populations that are doing better. It doesn't mean there isn't any problem as well, but I think that the more we move on, the more we should think about globalization, less about the ability to import cheap goods, but the ability to import genuine and goods that you would find it very hard to obtain somewhere in the Paris region. It's about the ability to basically understand fully the costs of your actions. And it's true that in this system right now, this is not as easy as it is for the everyday consumer. And this is where governments might start to help, basically trying to inform the public and get them to understand what every single action they make, every single decision they make, what is the actual cost of that specifically? You asked a very good question. I don't know what climate change is if I'm an everyday person. I don't have the time to invest to basically understand what that means. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I know that the catastrophe movies of The Day After Tomorrow and was it 2012 or 2020 anyway? I know those are just entertainment. I don't even know what that means tomorrow morning for my children. More and more and more, thanks to the work of the scientists, we're starting to understand that a little bit more. And I think we understand that far more than we did 5 years ago. So I'm a little bit more optimistic about the human race and our ability to adapt. But
unfortunately, we've known this for more than 50 years, though. That's the problem.
But not the everyday person.
As we're going to find out when we come back.
Hold on, wait. Yeah, okay.
As we're going to find out when we come back, it's becoming much more of a political issue, and it is front and center for many with these upcoming European elections. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're talking on the heels of a major biodiversity summit that took place here in Paris at the UN Science branch, UNESCO. With us to talk about it, she took part in deliberations among 132 nations. Kate Broman, lead scientist at the Global Water Initiative of the University of Minnesota. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Henri Landes of the advocacy group Landestini, and who teaches, by the way, sustainable development at Paris's Sciences Po Political Science Institute. Jérémy Guez, who teaches international affairs and economics at Paris's HEC Business School. And from Le Crotoy, she's a candidate for the European elections. Patricia Chagnon, regional councillor for the Hauts-de-France region from Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National party. The recent fire at Notre-Dame Cathedral, the good news was the 200,000 bees on the roof were saved. That was the good news. But it acted for many as a reminder. Environmentalists claim there are more bees in the greater Paris area than in places like rural Normandy. And again, that's a reminder that even though, Jérémy Guez, as you were saying before, things don't seem tangible, they are to a degree.
They are, increasingly, they are, without a doubt. But I think that they're getting tangible with a population that is getting a little bit more information, that is able to process it, rather than being force-fed something, again, in a political climate in which I think a large part of the population still thinks that the rules of the game are rigged against them. So that's kind of the problem. The process through which we go through this is going to be a slow one, a very frustrating one that is not going to be without any bumps in the road. But I think that when you think about the availability of information that we have today, in my opinion, my humble opinion, it's far more significant today than it used to be even 5 years ago.
Yeah, because we saw in 2016, there was the presidential election where there was talk that, oh yeah, the environment, that's something that's talked about among elitists. Those who work in coal mines are being left out of the conversation. The system is rigged, as Jérémy Guez was saying. You agree with that premise?
I think there are a lot of people who are very concerned about that, and potentially rightly so. What we do really need to communicate, because what's really true is that the environment does affect all of us. And whether we believe it or not, what I like to say is the water cycle that you learned about in the 4th grade, it works. And we know that the way that the environment regulates our air and our water and the climate, whether or not we believe in it, it still happens. And if we don't take care of it, we put ourselves in peril.
Now, Kate Broman, we talked earlier about the short supply circuit. Earlier, we spoke with the Canadian Environment Minister. And she defended a lot of the ideas that we're talking about. But when we said to her, well, right now there's a free trade agreement that's up for ratification between Canada and the European Union to increase trade by 25% over great distances. Isn't one of the conclusions of your report that we shouldn't be buying stuff from the other side of the planet quite so much?
It's a real mix. The key here is the quite so much. Yeah. So really thinking about how much are we producing and how much are we consuming. From a strictly technical standpoint, I would say there's actually lots of benefits to globalization. We know that as the climate changes, we're seeing more droughts, more fires, more floods. And when we have a global system of food production, that means that people don't have to go hungry when catastrophic things happen in specific places. It means that we can grow food in places with more abundant water or more abundant sunshine. We don't want to do that all the time for all of our food, and we want to make sure that we are really wrapping into the price of our food and really all of our goods all of the underlying environmental processes that let those things continue to be produced. That's one of the things we saw in this report. We actually are producing more food, more timber, more materials, but the underlying processes that are going to let us keep doing that over time are really in decline.
Patricia Chagnon, you agree that it's too, how should we say it, it's too simplistic to sweep away globalization with one stroke of the hand?
Well, I just want to come back onto something that Jeremy Gaz said before. He said that a lot of people feel that the rules are rigged when you talk about ecology. And I just want to make a statement on that, because I'm elected in a very rural area where people live, very close to nature. And in France, we had the hikes in the petrol prices. Increased taxation is like on the a project to increase taxation again for consuming fossil fuel. So a lot of people feel that they are being punished. And what we are saying is that ecology should not be a punitive ecology. We believe that we should bring awareness to people. We should make them aware of what is happening in the world around us. And all should be converging to explaining to people that when you start consuming locally, you are actually going to increase the quality of the food you consume, and you're also going to be helping the planet. So I believe that the globalization, contrary to what Kate was just talking about, yes, has a massive impact on the environment and a massive negative impact of the environment. I will not deny that there were certain benefits, but on the whole, no one is going to convince me that when we have a trade agreement with Canada and we're going to be starting to import pork and chicken, which are about, I think, 20 or 30% cheaper in Canada to produce in Canada than to produce in France, that's actually going to improve the environment. It is not going to improve the environment, and we should really be fighting against that. And that's what we stand for.
That's not the claim of the Environment Minister. The claim of the Environment Minister is that you also need to, people have to have jobs on both sides.
People have to have jobs on both sides. We have about 7 million unemployed people in France, and I think they need their jobs. We've got one suicide by a farmer every other day in France at the moment because they can't live off their land. So this is not logical. France is in the perfect region of the planet to be producing foods, and we are actually having our farmers not being able to live off the land. I think the big question is there. How are we going to make it, again, possible that the French farmers can feed the French people? This is an ecological issue. This is a health issue. This is a social issue. And this is an ecological issue, which is very high in our political program and for which we stand in order to show that everybody can contribute to having a better environment. And that is not a punitive situation.
Let me ask Henri Landès about this. So Patricia Chagnon talking about the fact that it's better to, what needs to be done is to give sustainability to French farmers.
Well, I don't have a very nationalistic approach to this. I have a more territorial one. And I feel that if you live on the border of Italy and you consume products from Italy, and instead of on the other side of France, then I think that that's interesting. And I don't think she actually disagrees with that. But I
No, I agree with you.
I listen. There's validity to what Kate and Jeremy was saying. Even in my opinion, if solidarity at the global level is important, thanks to our ability to produce in certain areas. It's just that nature doesn't really produce its things. When I say things, I say plant species of animals that are edible, that can be used for different resources, to be for manufacturing, etc. It doesn't produce things in an intensive, non-diverse way, in a sustainable way, meaning that there's no reason to be producing at huge in order to make economies of scale in one country, so that we export it to another country, and then in the name of globalization. That's actually ideological. That's to say that in the name of globalization, we should just be looking for the comparative advantage between different countries and use nature for our economic benefit. And that's not really natural, and that doesn't go in the sense of preserving the environment. What goes in the sense of preserving the environment and our health is consuming food that is non-polluted and not polluting in the way we get it into our plates, meaning reducing the amount of transportation. Unfortunately, what's happened is we've distorted it so much that it's actually less polluting from a carbon standpoint to import sheep from New Zealand than it is to eat sheep from France. And that's just where you realize we've completely messed up our way of doing the economy worldwide. So it's a matter of completely changing our indicators as well, and saying, why are we pricing things so distortedly, taking into account the environmental costs and the health costs? The problem with the price argument right now is that we're paying things way cheaper when they are more pollutant. And then we blame organic and local products by saying that they're too expensive. It's really the other things that are not expensive enough. And because of the way we've organized our economies, and we've worked on what we think are strengths in different countries by choosing and specializing different production. And I think if there's one thing we should do, it's go away from specializing production and back to diversifying. And you actually realize that a lot of things are edible around you. We just forget that. You can find like hundreds of different plants and edible things just around your territory, but we've completely forgotten about that because we've gone in a very industrialized production method.
All right, and it's definitely, again, an issue. Now, just very briefly, go ahead, Patricia Chagnon.
Yes, just a very brief comment. I'm very happy to hear that. And yes, we do stand for a taxation of products according to their distance and according to the pollution that they generate while getting to the local market. So we want to tax import of products coming from far away, which can be produced locally, to actually adapt their price, to bring their price up so that they don't compete with local production, who very rightly so is, as the previous speaker said, is in an unfair competition with produce being flown in. We stand for that taxation, which is a very important point.
And on that point, you may not be so far away from France's president at his big press conference a little more than 2 weeks ago. Emmanuel Macron mentioning the environment almost in the same breath as he mentioned border protection.
The success of this transition depends on our commitment to Europe, our capacity to defend at the European level the need to achieve a minimum carbon price, a carbon tax on borders, and a more ambitious green finance plan.
Tax carbon at the border, Jeremy Guez. Of course, he's saying at the border of Europe, but it's not very different from what we just heard from
No, I don't think it is. And I don't think anyone really disagrees with this point of view. When I mentioned transparency initially, it was just basically trying to reintegrate into the price the actual costs of what your actions represent. And I think this is where we really need to improve. What's interesting to me is that on the theory side, Henry was talking about a competitive advantage. I think that there are many pieces who are revisiting that concept, not putting it in the garbage, but saying the way we calculate that competitive advantage needs to account for this. There's also the work, dates a little bit back 8 years ago, Michael Porter, Shared Value, who basically says, let's try to basically rethink our approach to profitability, to making profits, meaning let's not put that into question. That would be another revolution for another debate, but basically try to rethink the parameters that you're integrating in your profit equation, meaning that you might be creating even more value, an ecosystem that's more durable around you. And this is why you might need to invest in local populations, if anything, because at a very cynical level, you'll get a far better trained population and a far healthier population. So I think this is happening. It takes a little bit of time.
I would like to say, though, that one of the things that we really see in this report that we've come out with is that we can't think about just Europe. We can't think about just the US or just the Americas. We really have to think about the whole world, and governments have to work together to do this.
I was going to say, on this issue of carbon pricing, we can call up a map here. Carbon pricing, taxing how when we pollute, right? Effectively, when we use fossil fuels. It still seems that it's in its infancy. When you look at that map of the world there that's in front of you and in front of the screen, those are the nations in green, the ones that are already have carbon pricing. China's toying with the idea, but it's still not the law of the land there, nor is it in India. And it's only in certain select U.S. States, not including Minnesota, by the way.
We just are moving towards being carbon neutral by, I can't remember the date.
But do you price carbon?
We do not yet price carbon.
What do you think of that idea?
I think there is a lot of potential in carbon pricing. One of the things that we need to do is really make sure that not just carbon, but all kinds of what in economics we call externalities, so things that are outside of the normal costs of production are put into the cost of production. One of the best examples of this is water pollution. So all over Europe and in the United States, we passed laws that said if you are manufacturing something, you cannot just dump your waste into a river. You have to clean it up. It has to be something that you do in the factory, and that if it's costly, you wrap that into the cost of your product. You can't just put it out into the environment. And the idea that we do something like either a carbon tax or regulations or even incentives to really make sure that instead of putting that pollution out there so that it affects everyone, we put it into where it came from.
On this, are we at a, pardon the pun, a watershed moment?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with this, what Kate just said about moving away from just the carbon as your indicator. And this was more of a biodiversity conference, which is a conference on life on Earth. Carbon is only one issue that we should be looking at. And unfortunately, that's mostly what we've put into very tangible math for politicians as of yet. And when we are able to say to a company, it would be worth this much for you to stop polluting, and then even better, to regenerate biodiversity around your activity, that's when we'll probably get companies signing up to this effort much more actively. I also think that at some point, maybe we could just prohibit certain things and stop always trying to just incentivize, because at some point it's going to look very, very criminal to keep destroying biodiversity with certain activities. And we've prohibited
like
a lot of
what?
different things.
Give me
certain substances. I mean, we outlawed several different substances and pesticides in the past, and we can't do it with fossil fuels because that's too large in our economy. But there are a lot of different substances and practices, such as maybe perhaps just dumping waste into an area and not cleaning it up. I think that at some point we can just say that's a criminal act.
All right. We want to go green. Again, I want to come back to the politics of this, Alger Amiguez. We want to go green, but we don't want to pay more at the pump either. The Yellow Vest movement started as a protest against diesel fuel rise in fuel tax rises. And the front page of the local newspaper here in Paris, Le Parisien, this Monday, reminds us that prices at the pump right now are at their highest since April of 2013. As a result, to be bolder, do politicians really want to do that and face the fury of motorists?
We've tried it. We've had our share of trouble in this country. And what's interesting is that the government walked it back in a very clumsy way, some would say, or in a very honest way of trial and error. And this is what politics is about. I think that we need to be a little bit pragmatic as well. And perhaps I am fully in agreement about the need for cooperation between government. But there's also another part of the puzzle that we might not have talked about. It's the technology part. And I know this is a little bit more controversial, but I am somewhat more of an optimist on the technological front in terms of what artificial intelligence is going to help us do, in terms of better allocation of resources, in terms of cutting all of the unneeded use of energy, and so on and so forth. And I think that, indeed, you can look at the indicator of oil at the pump. You can look at this from the very short standpoint and ask, what's my approval rating going to be as a politician? But you really have to, I think, to have a little bit more of a holistic way. And this is where you start to engage, I think, with private corporations, saying, you know, all of those investments in research and development, they're going to pay off, but don't rely exclusively on the state.
Patricia Chagnon?
Yes, definitely on this subject. Some very important contribution I want to make. Yes, prices in the pump have skyrocketed. We don't need to be going into the yellow vests very much. But I do want to put a position here in that the rocketing prices of fuel are most certainly damaging to people who live in rural France. And those are exactly the same people who are suffering from trains closing and from public transport diminishing. So I think there is something very important here in saying we don't want this to be punitive. At the same time that the government is closing a train line right here from Abbeville to Le Tréport, you know, the people who use this to go to work, to go to school, they are obliged to take their cars and they're being hit by increased taxes. So what is really important is to have a very global view on this. And when Mr. Macron says on one hand that he wants to protect the environment, but on the other hand, he actually closes train lines or signs international trade agreements, there is something not very logical in there. We need to see this as a holistic issue, and we need to put the people of France, but of course, Italy, Germany, the people of the world, right in the center of the whole problem. They need to be able to move for work. They need to bring their kids to school. They need to
they need to get their people to work. Very quickly, because
we cannot oblige them. We cannot oblige them by making them pay more taxes. Yes, that's what created the yellow vest, and that's what made them go out on the streets. We need a fair system.
Kate Broman, let me ask you, because we here in France noticed when there were the debates in 2016 between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, the environment didn't come up at all, really. And is it going to be the same in 2020?
I hope not. I'm excited to see a wide range of voices in the 2020 election. Coming up to this, there's a lot of people who are very interested in the environment, in climate, and I think one of the things we've seen over the past even 4 to 5 months is that there's been a real change in how people are thinking about and talking about
4 to 5 months.
Yeah, Greta Thunberg, that this is something that is this is on people's minds, and people are really recognizing how important it is and thinking about how all of us, we care about where we live. We care about our homes. We want to be good stewards, and we want to be able to be good stewards of the planet.
Kate Broman, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Henri Mendès, Jérémy Guez, Patricia Chagnon for being with us from Le Crotoy in northern France. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there. Yes, been taking a look at how this is all playing out online, just having the usual obligatory computer problem at the moment.
That's the joys of live television.
I know, every time. Yes, what I found interesting is the way in which people were trying to really show a difference between the issues of climate change and this much broader issue, which really, I think the New York Times picked the perfect image to illustrate this story today, because it really brings home just what man's role is in all of this, all the suffering of the species that we share this earth with. This is an olive ridley sea turtle photographed on a beach in India earlier this this year. And what they say in this article is that there is a dire threat to ecosystems that people all over the world depend on for their survival, bringing it back really to the idea that if you're self-interested enough, perhaps you might care about this poor turtle, because there is this idea that people just don't listen until they actually feel it's going to hit home with them. And I still think there is a problem with people not believing that it's actually going to impact on real human day-to-day life. But obviously this report is saying very much something else entirely. The Guardian saying human society under urgent threat from loss of Earth's natural life. They're quoting that 1 million species figure again, 1 million species under threat. I think it's also interesting to look at it in terms of 1 in every 8 species of plant or animal life is under threat, because 1 million, we kind of can't envisage that. But if you look outside your window and you look at animals and plants and think 1 in every 8 of those could go, it starts to bring home the magnitude of what's actually being talked about here.
Is it getting through with policymakers?
Oh, well, that's a big question. The interesting thing is that it seems like people really can't make up their minds when it comes to matters of climate change. This gentleman who now writes speeches for Bernie Sanders says we're basically living in a sci-fi dystopia movie and yet going about our business pretending everything is totally fine. And I think there is an element of that. Extinction Rebellion, which of course took to the streets in London last month, there was quite a bit of pushback about their very much hands-on, let's disrupt people approach to making climate and the environment the first thing that people talked about. However, it worked. It got it on all of the news programmes. What they've said today about this report is that our way of life is causing nature to collapse. With this devastating news comes an opportunity, though, they say, a chance to help nature heal. The choice before us is extinction or rebellion. But there is this issue of if you take direct action, you're seen as a hooligan and written off. But if you just talk very politely about it, people might shake their heads and say, oh, that's terrible, but then they move on and forget about it.
And that's what was said here in France about the yellow vest violence. If there's no violence, we don't talk about it. If you don't super glue yourself to a suburban train like that old man did in London, no one's talking about it either. You agree with that?
Yeah, but I think that what we're seeing as well, the broader subject here is how do we reinvent activism? And I think that's the fundamental problem. I think that many people are put off by the violence that we've seen in the streets of Paris, and that agree with the problem, but that don't agree with the type of action that you need to undertake. And it's about what type of activism can you actually put forward, one that is a citizen one, and that is oriented towards impact.
You do have to ask what can people do, because Greta Thunberg has certainly got people talking about the environment, but she's also earned an awful lot of criticism. And all she's doing is encouraging kids to take a day out of school, to go on strike and show their support for the planet and how important it is to them. But she gets criticised even for that. The Spectator, which is quite a right-leaning magazine in the UK, basically talks about her being less of a one-girl revolution, more a PR creation that allows her arguments to go unchallenged because journalists are too scared of putting her on the spot. They talk about basically the left is seeking to use climate alarmism to further their war on global capitalism, which just in light of this report today and in light of every other scientific finding of the last decade, it seems amazing to me that they would use a term like climate alarmism. There is a problem, but people just won't accept it if it doesn't suit their narrative.
Henri Landès, you surprised at...
It's a ludicrous argument. I don't understand what arguments of hers are not challenged. She's not even making any arguments. She's saying that science is not being listened to. Could we please start listening to the science? Otherwise, why should I go to school? It's not really a scientific argument that's being unchallenged. The war of the left, and she's not really a candidate or a politician either. She's a young teenage girl on global capitalism has obviously not succeeded. So I don't really know what they're worried about at the Spectator anyway. Lastly, the bottom line is, what are we doing every day in our life to regenerate and preserve biodiversity? That's all that matters now, is our citizens actually preserving biodiversity and regenerating it in their daily life. And that's not easy to do. And that's exactly what we should be explaining, is how do I actually go and contribute to biodiversity regeneration, or to a project that might be a little farther away from me and contribute to biodiversity preservation elsewhere. And that means, how do I spend my money? What am I doing concretely? Am I contributing to a vegetable garden? Am I contributing to planting trees somewhere? And that, I think, is much more tangible, and citizens would like much more than just debates about different measures that the politicians are unable to actually make a decision on.
All right. Well, that'll be our final word.
Oh, thank you.
No, on this, many thanks. I want to thank Emma, James. I want to thank the rest of our panel.